One of the great difficulties of having a faith crisis is that you suddenly have to reevaluate all of the stories that make you up. And as humans, as storytelling creatures, one of our ways of creating social cohesion and learning about our place in the world, knowing where we belong in the structure of things, knowing where our life is in terms of its trajectory, is through the stories that we absorb. And Mormonism, of course, is very heavy on faith-promoting stories, as is all of Christianity. Stories are just a really central part of how we understand ourselves and also how we make sense of the world. When you go through a faith deconstruction or a faith crisis, though, you have to confront all of those building blocks that have made up your idea of who you are and where you fit into the world, and have to start reevaluating what they mean, and are they still worthy of being part of your personal mythological canon? And do they support you in going to where you want to go with the trajectory of your life, now that you don't appreciate or align with the overall practiced values of your religion of origin? This is something that I've thought about a lot as I've gone through my deconstruction of Mormonism, because I truly love and am thrilled by a good story. And because I recognize how important stories are to adapting us into our world. And as more people leave their religions and experience like these big overwhelming attachment wounds, and then also have to give up their religious stories of origin, that creates a lot of weird dynamics for people, where you can't just replace a mythological foundation overnight. Even if you lost your testimony overnight because of the CES letter, you really can't replace the mythological roots that you have grown through your decades in Mormonism. Thus, it's very important to analyze the types of stories that are still playing roles for you in your psychic makeup. Like, what is forming the mythological foundation for your actions? Which stories do you reach to justify your actions? Which stories do you go to remind yourself that you belong, or that you have purpose, or that your work matters, or that your family matters? These are all questions that have to do with how you are drawing sustenance to yourself on a psychic, mental plane. Where are you getting your stories from? What are those stories telling you? What are they telling you about yourself, about others, about people who don't look like you? What does it tell you to do in relationship to them? What does it tell you your duties are as a parent, as a caregiver, as a neighbor, etc.? These are all really important questions that are informed by our framework of stories. And as we leave a religion or a high demand group, one of the natural reactions that we're going to have is revulsion towards anything that reminds us of that group or that environment that so damaged us. However, after that initial cycle of deconstruction, where we forcibly repel from the thing that we don't like, that isn't true, that isn't serving us or whatever, then we have this second wave of deconstruction that will come up in a softer way as time goes on, as we realize that when we are confronting a decision about aggression versus pacifism, for example, that we still only have in our bank of stories about Captain Moroni, or about the Lamanites who laid down their arms, or about Daniel in the lion's den, or the children of Israel coming in to conquer Canaan, or other things like that. We might only have those stories in our story bank to inform us about certain actions and what to do in the real world. And if we haven't examined that relationship, that crossover between our mythic reservoir of stories and our actions in the real world, then we are likely to start taking actions that are very uninformed and very swayed by the conviction, rhetoric, or charisma of whoever seems to be in the lead at the time, because we no longer have access to our own mythic reservoir to inform our behaviors. So how do we do that? How do we examine that connection between our mythic reservoir and our actions? And how do we change our mythic reservoir if we don't like it? Or how do we update our interpretation of that mythic reservoir so that it better serves our current life and actions? Those are the questions I want to tackle with you today. I have 3 quick examples to give you on my Mythic Reservoir and how I have updated that now as a Post-Mormon. All of these were stories that I leaned on heavily as a believing LDS Christian Mormon. And because I spent so many decades thinking about and rereading these stories and rewatching the movies based on these things, those roots still exist for me today. That I still think about a lot of these stories in the way that they felt true to me. And surprisingly, even after my deconstruction, there were parts of the stories that kept feeling true, although they weren't necessarily the same parts of the stories that I felt like were true before my deconstruction. And after my deconstruction, I felt more empowered to sift those parts out of the story so that I could still enjoy and find value in the parts that were mythically resonant without feeling like I had to accept the whole kit and caboodle just because I liked this one part of the story. So let's start with story number 1. And again, this is going to be a super brief overview. If you'd like to hear more on in any of these stories in depth, I would love to talk about it. I could talk all day about stories and story analysis. So tell me below if you want to hear more about any of these, because I think it's so fun to dig into a good story and to dig out the diamonds of wisdom and transformation from the structure of the story itself, from the characters that it employs, from the subconscious of people. There's just so much rich, juicy goodness in the way that people represent their subconscious in stories. And these 3 stories are no exception. Story number 1 is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. And I'm taking as part of this also the Chronicles of Narnia, which are the other 6 books in the series. This is a classic in children's literature. It's been around for more than 75 years now and is still a favorite by many. In fact, my child was just assigned to read this at school, and it set off a slew of reading the Chronicles of Narnia with my kids. Now you might ask, why would you read that super Christian book with your kids as a post-religious person? Wasn't that kind of complicated? Why didn't you write into the teacher? I totally could have done that. But I feel like it's important to know these myths because a lot of people know them and have found value in them. And I have found value in them. And so rather than rejecting the parts of myself or the parts of others that have found a lot of resonance from these books, I think it's way more useful to sink into them and see what they can tell you, even as a post-religious person. Now, in this case, rereading the books with my kids, I was in the uncomfortable position of realizing that this story that I had loved for so many years as a Mormon does not hold up very well after leaving the church. And even though there are scenes that I find to still be very magical and relevant, overall, the story still feels too heavy-handed and pretty cheesy in that very saccharine Christian way to fully enjoy reading it. So in this short analysis, I'd like to take one thing that has transmuted across the boundary of my faith crisis and one thing that has stayed resonant, has stayed the same from this story. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, 4 children get transported to Narnia through a magic wardrobe and end up meeting a whole cast of talking animals and mythical creatures with whom they work to overthrow the authoritarian overlord of this world that they have gotten into and establish the 4 children as the new kings and queens of Narnia. One of the things that really changed for me across the bridge of my deconstruction was the way that this book relies upon sexism. There's a deep underlying current of sexism, most pronounced between the hero, Aslan, the Jesus figure, and the White Witch, who is the authoritarian overlord of Narnia at the time that the children arrive. And the characterization of the White Witch is of course very unappealing. She would be horrible to work for. She would be horrible to interact with. The problematic thing about this representation is how well it codifies and reflects the very sexist and misogynistic attitudes of especially Christian men towards women who have power, who are in positions of leadership, who interact with the natural world or the magical world or have any identification with the term witch, which is not an inherently bad word or a slur. It was made a bad word by the Christian church in the Middle Ages. and who are independent from the patriarchal structure. And in Narnia, that is the structure that starts with the emperor beyond the sea, who is supposed to represent God the Father in the Christian canon, and then goes down to Aslan, who represents Jesus from the Christian canon, and from there it goes down to the kings of Narnia, and then the queens of Narnia, and then the peasantry. Reading the Chronicles of Narnia as a fully believing Mormon, this kind of sexism was vaguely palpable to me, but I was so enmeshed with a system that was teaching me to internalize sexism and misogyny towards myself that it didn't feel any different from the system I was already in. And so in that way, it just kind of felt normal. And I was able to focus on the other themes of the book rather than be totally distracted by the sexism. However, after I left and began to investigate more fully the indigenous roots of my Western European heritage, which led me into the medieval witch hunting practices and the burning times and the horrendous enforced misogyny from the church that was codified into the reprehensible use of the word witch. All of a sudden, this story from Narnia took on a much more sinister bent. Just like for most Christians, women are presented as kind of like the vessels of evil into the world. It was Eve who ate the apple, and it was her sin that set us off on this fallen course, and it's women who are constantly dilly-dallying and looking for other ways to be spiritual other than this super patriarchal, rigid him over all model of things. And this kind of thinking has just done so much damage to the world, has done so much damage to individual women, has done damage to families, has done damage to communities, has done damage to health care and health service, has done damage to every single part of our society. If you read about the medieval witch hunts and the burning times, there is no question that this set humanity back a pace, and that this patriarchal exertion of hatred towards women, of violence, was not something designed to serve people. It was designed to serve this system, this egregore of patriarchy that is behind all of the Christian religions and arguably behind all of the monotheisms. Long story short, reading the Chronicles of Narnia after I had left Mormonism exposed the fact that these stories were extremely sexist and extremely limited in how they portray female characters and what it means to be a woman and how women are to use or exert their power in the world. And because the treatment of the sexes is always a mirror image, that men have not been benefited either by the misogyny of patriarchy, and that is also reflected in Narnia, that the scope or the breadth of representation of male characters is also pretty narrow and is also pretty scripted. There is more than there is for women, and there are a lot of interesting character arcs in all of the characters in their own rights, but the range of experience for the characters overall is finite. But moving on, one of the things that survived the reading of the Chronicles of Narnia across my deconstruction to my new life as a post-religious person, I find that the characterization of Aslan is really evocative. I don't mean the Jesus stuff. That gets kind of heavy-handed, but the other stuff, the stuff that's kind of on the edges of his character, still feels really relevant to me as a representation of deity or the divine. And when I was an active believing Mormon, this was also really evocative because I felt like the divine presence that I was interacting with as a Mormon was at the same time both majestic and mundane. It was a presence I could speak to personally and that would have a sense of humor back with me. And now as a post-religious person, I'm less likely to ascribe that all to one figure or deity, because I think that there are lots of spiritual forces that are around us all the time, and we may not know what most of those are. However, when I was a Mormon, those characterizations of Aslan as not a tame lion, he's not necessarily safe, but he is good, those kinds of things were really powerful and beautiful to me, and they felt like they reflected my experience with this divine voice or this divine presence too. After my deconstruction, I found to my surprise that was still there, that I still felt that divine presence. And as I reestablished my existential attachment to ancestors, to divine forces, towards supernatural forces, as I reestablished that awareness of those things and sensitivity to the spirit, as it would be called in Mormonism, I found those characterizations of divinity have survived. And I still really value Lewis for bringing that into my psychic reservoir of myth, because seeing Aslan reflect these qualities of divinity is a powerful anchor point for me to know that, like, this is not isolated to just me. This is the way that a lot of humans are experiencing this divine force. And even if Lewis was interpreting that to mean that that was Jesus, and I'm interpreting it to mean the divine feminine or my ancestor or something else, even if there is that dichotomy, I do find a sense of belonging from reading about Lewis's interpretation of Aslan, because I recognize it. I recognize his descriptions of Aslan on the peripheries. Again, not so much on his characterization of Aslan as this patriarchal Jesus, but in his other descriptions of Aslan, I find there to be a lot of resonance there, and still enjoy when those descriptions come up in my psychic interpretation of events now as a post-Mormon. All right, that does it for Chronicles of Narnia. Of course, if you'd like to talk more about the Chronicles of Narnia, I'm all over it. Let me know, because I really considered doing like a full read aloud of this entire book series so that we could go chapter by chapter and be like, and this is the problem with this chapter, and this is what's cool about it. There's so many of those moments in Narnia. And if reading the Chronicles of Narnia was a key part of bolstering your faith while you were in your religion of origin, then deconstructing it or being able to address it as a post-religious person can be so therapeutic and fun. But moving on, let's go now to C.S. Lewis's bestie, J.R.R. Tolkien. I actually think that C.S. Lewis was less of a bestie to J.R.R. Tolkien than Tolkien was to Lewis, because if you do read the two book series side by side, you'll realize that Lewis was kind of probably lifting a lot of stuff from Tolkien's work as they were in the same writing club, and you can almost see Lewis like listening to Tolkien read this one draft of a chapter and then being like, oh yeah, that's a great idea, I'm going to include that in my story. You can almost see those like threads crossing over from one to the other. But anyway, back to Tolkien. The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings are maybe the richest cultural mythic reservoir for the Western world, other than maybe the Bible or possibly Grimm fairy tales. That might be the only contender, I think. So many people read the books when they first came out, and then so many more read them after they watched the movies in the early 2000s, that now it is just part of the cultural consciousness, this series of stories. And for me, as a post-Mormon, these are still some of the stories that I reach back to watch every single year. I watch the movies, and we are currently reading through the book series. Why would I do that? Because it's so Catholic, right? Tolkien actually said that The Lord of the Rings was a fundamentally religious text and very Catholic, that it wasn't so when he was first writing it, but that as he was revising it, it consciously became a religious work for him. So what relevance could that possibly have for me as a religious person? Well, going back to the subconscious themes, when an author is writing from their imagination, they are going to be transmitting more than just what their conscious mind thinks that they are transmitting. And Tolkien was so immersed in his own mythology that he just birthed for us this gorgeous representation of his subconscious. And I learn so much from interacting with these stories regularly. Not everything, they are not without problems, okay? But they are profound. So let's talk about my two things from this story. One thing that was transmuted through my faith deconstruction, and one thing that survived my faith deconstruction. As anyone knows who has read the books, these books are full of battles. They are full of this overarching war between good and evil, between the dark forces of Sauron and the light forces of the elves and men and dwarves and all those things. And that dichotomy between light and dark is something that is very prevalent in Christian lore as well. And when I was a believing Mormon, this also fit into my paradigm of the world, that there are the light forces and there are the dark forces. And since we started our existence in the premortal war in heaven, where the forces of God were fighting against the forces of Satan, and the forces of Satan were all dark, and the forces of God were all light, and all of the dark forces got kicked out of heaven, and they fell down to earth, and then God sent his light forces down to work. And at that point, it gets a lot more theologically messy as to like why God sent all of these super powered demons down to an earth and then made all of us ignorant as we came down to earth in order to just be like tempted and subjected by them or whatever. Anyway, I'm not here to battle about the theological stuff because I don't believe any of it anymore. But this is just to say that from my Mormon context, this battle of light and dark and the ongoing struggle in the forms of violent conflict were very coherent to me as a Mormon, because in Mormonism we also framed everything as a battle, as a war, as an aggressive confrontation. We thought of ourselves as soldiers. My mission president called us the Green Berets. We were constantly being put into this mindset of being like soldiers, an army. We're part of the army of God. We're the sons and daughters of Helaman, whatever it is. It was always in terms of a war. And leaving Mormonism, I kind of woke up to that for the first time. And I was like, wait a minute. Why are we making this into a war? We don't have to be at war. We don't have to be at war with anyone. There are other ways to solve things. People like waking up to that. After my faith crisis, it felt like such a duh moment that I really struggle to get through the parts of Lord of the Rings now where the characters are framing things only in terms of the battle, with a fight, with a confrontation, instead of trying to do more diplomacy. And instead of assuming, like, for example, that Saruman could come back to their side. It actually just flabbergasts me that the forces that are fighting to save Middle-earths are not more interested in using seductive power to reintegrate the lost parts that have gone over to the side of Sauron. Like, why? Why don't you try to reintegrate Saruman? Or why don't you try to go to some of these communities of men that are supporting Sauron's war on the main front? Why don't you go to them and talk to them about like, hey, are you really doing what you think you're doing? And maybe you should come fight for us instead. Like, those kinds of things are totally missing from the book. And there's this very straightforward masculine type of problem solving that is just used over and over again whenever they're trying to do something in these stories. And now as a post-Mormon, I can really see the problems with that. Then just to tack on, there's also the sexism problem in Lord of the Rings too, which I'm very aware of now, but since I talked about that with Narnia, I will leave that to the side for this critique. But moving on to something that has survived my deconstruction from the Lord of the Rings, I have always really appreciated the contrast that is drawn in these stories between the simple folk of Middle-earth, like the hobbits, and the powers that desire domination over Middle-earth, like Sauron and then later Saruman and some other characters. I feel like the parable of Lord of the Rings is maybe most potent to me in that contrast, and in the way that Tolkien represented the immense pleasure and opportunity for a happy life that is available to all of us through living simply and close to the earth. Because of course, the anchoring aspect of the entire series is the Shire, the homeland of the hobbits, which is just green rolling hills, it's pastures, it's livestock, it's growing things in your own garden, it's drinking together at the pub, it's working together in the different tasks of the community, it's gossiping and it's smoking your pipe and it's throwing parties and it's laughing at your friend when they get too drunk to stand up. Like, that is the essence of the Shire. And there's something so beautiful about the way that Tolkien has portrayed this simple life and made it magical, like made these simple things magical. And I find it remarkable whenever I watch the series of Lord of the Rings that, like, most of the time in the story we spend outside of the Shire, but there is never a time when it's far from our thoughts. that we're hyper aware the whole time that the reason that Bilbo goes with the dwarves to reclaim Erebor, or the reason that Frodo goes on this horrendous quest to destroy the ring and possibly lose himself in the process, is because he values this connection to home, to community, to land, to the space that made him. He values the preservation of that even more than he values his own comfort or his own life. And that's really beautiful. And you could say the same thing about the other characters in Lord of the Rings. I take that in my post-Mormon life to represent, like, there is so much goodness and it's worth living for. It's worth working for. It is worth speaking out for. And I love the Lord of the Rings for those elements of friendship, those elements of bonding, those elements of loyalty, and also even, on the aggressive side of things, I value Lord of the Rings for showing how costly and how despicable war is. If you finish Lord of the Rings and have really understood what you watched, you feel the loss. And you feel how hard it has been, how scraping, how wrenching it has been to lose these precious souls in pursuit of defending Middle-earth. And I think that Tolkien felt that after experiencing World War I and probably experienced it again from just watching World War II. And I find that to be a valuable reality check in our current media landscape, which really loves to glorify violence and war and loves to have a lot of chest pounding heroes who are just going to go into the fight and kick some ass. That has its appeal, but it's not really grounded in reality. We have to remember that is fantasy violence, and that when it comes to real war, real violence, a lot is lost, always. And I feel like Tolkien does an admirable job of representing that while also creating a fantasy that allows you to walk away from the movie without feeling overly heavy. So that's what I got for you about Lord of the Rings. And if you want to talk about that one more in depth, then let me know about that too, because it's super fun. Third and last, I want to talk about this. I don't know whether to call it 1 book, 2 books, 3 books, or more than that books. It's my Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants. It's basically the legacy of myth given to us as Mormons, specifically through Joseph Smith. Now, this one is a little bit more complicated than the other two, because while the Chronicles of Narnia and The Lord of the Rings are explicitly represented as fantasies, as fictions. They are marketed like that. C.S. Lewis and Tolkien both knew that they were fictions or fantasies as they were creating these stories. And even if they smudged those lines a bit by saying well, I feel like it could be historical. I wanted to make a mythic history for Middle-earth or the UK. Or what Lewis said, he thought of Aslan as Jesus. And so when a mother wrote to him with concern that her son was showing more affection for Aslan than he was for Jesus, C.S. Lewis responded and said, "Don't worry about it, it's the same thing." He thought of Aslan as Jesus. However, there is still a more explicit line drawn in the sand between this and reality than there is between the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants and reality. And I think that's where a lot of the damage of the Book of Mormon and the D&C comes from, is that they are presented as history, as fact, as direct transmissions channeled from God. And while there are some stray apologists out there who are like, maybe we can take it symbolically, maybe it's just apocryphal, maybe it's just archetypal, that is not the mainstream attitude from a mainstream Mormon towards these texts. On the other side of things, you might be thinking, well, if they are not historical and if they culturally appropriated the Native Americans, then how can it have any value at all? Why would you want to keep this in your mythic reservoir at all? Why not just completely get rid of it? Black it out like you're chopping away the hieroglyphs of an apostate king? Well, I think that is a really good concern. And the answer is not very simple. This is a part of my mythic reservoir that I simply have to accept because it's there, not reinforce because I like it so much. The fact is that I did spend more than 3 decades of my life Mormon, and that I did read the Book of Mormon more than 24 times, and sometimes I would read it in 24-hour periods. I did that at least 4 times. So I have a lot of psychic roots reaching into the mythology of the Book of Mormon that still inform me today, but they don't inform me in the way that they used to inform me. So let's get into my 2 things. The first one is really easy. It's the racism. This book is super duper racist. It codified racism as part of the Mormon practice of religion, and it occurs regularly throughout the story of the Book of Mormon. It's a very racist narrative. And this is, of course, part of the very problematic nature of the Book of Mormon, is that it was culturally exploiting and extracting from the Native Americans of North and arguably South America and the Pacific Islands, and yet casting all of these millions of people into a story and into a lineage that was inherently and divinely racist. That's just super problematic. So how have I transmuted that? Well, I have done my best to try and track down these stories from the Native Americans that are actually represented in the Book of Mormon and go and learn those more fully. So I've used those stories from the Book of Mormon as an access point into the actual history and mythology of the native peoples of North and South America. And I found that to be extremely interesting. I cannot recommend enough researching and learning as much as you can from Native American authors, writers, creators, artists, because that way of seeing the world is very different from the way that the Western colonizers saw the world. And I would argue it's much more wholesome and beneficial to everyone. The second way that I have transmuted the racism of the Book of Mormon is to look at it in terms of Jungian analysis on Joseph Smith. So we talked a little bit about how Tolkien was just transmitting this huge epic straight from his subconscious into the mythology of Lord of the Rings. And I believe that you can do some of that with Book of Mormon too. Because even though Joseph Smith seems to have been lifting material from all kinds of other published texts, there is still a strong current of his subconscious represented in the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants. And I believe it's really interesting to look at that in terms of Jungian analysis. Like, how did he see the world? What were his neuroses about control or about power or about women? And what was his relationship to God or to temptation, and how do these texts show him grappling with that over time? Since I spent so many decades in Mormonism and was saturated in the perspectives and the hero worship of Joseph Smith, it is really necessary for me to see it this way. For me to be able to digest the things from the Book of Mormon in a way that allows me to integrate now as a post-religious person. And in the case of the Book of Mormon, these are just some of the ways that I've found out so far on how to do that. Moving on to the second point, something that has survived my deconstruction to continue to be valuable in my post-religious state. This is a little curio cabinet of things. It's not really just one thing that threads through all of the text, but there are little phrases or little concepts in the text or turns of the story that I have continued to find valuable even on this side of religion. For example, one of those things is the way that the Book of Mormon treats the mysteries of God. Also the Doctrine and Covenants. They both treat the mysteries of God with a lot of awe and respect. And while I was a Mormon, I just loved that phrase. I would study it all the time. And I was very engaged in trying to understand, what are the mysteries of God and how do we come to know them? And I felt like that was an incredibly feminine aspect of God, although I wouldn't have described it as feminine at that point. I am describing it now as feminine because that is one of the traits of the feminine energy or the divine feminine. This very feminine aspect of God, though, was a powerful anchor point for me into that same sense of the divine that I was finding in the periphery descriptions of Aslan. And so the little clues from the Book of Mormon about the mysteries of God and how great and wondrous the mysteries are for those that pursue and find them were really motivating to me as a Mormon. And as I have continued to follow a spiritual path as a post-religious person, those haven't lost their savor, so to speak. They have not become irrelevant. I still find myself pondering that word, the mysteries, and orienting towards understanding or accepting the immense mysteries behind life as part of my spiritual practice. Another example of one of these mythic curios that I have taken from the Book of Mormon is the time in Alma when there are multiple wars going on and they're finally ending. And there's this one verse in the Book of Mormon that says, like, after all of these wars, there were two different effects on the people. Some people hardened their hearts more as a result of the hard things that they had been through, and some were softer and more receptive due to the things that they had been through. And just like that phrase is so evocative. I thought about it as a Mormon and I loved it. And I think about it as a Post-Mormon and I still love it, because I think that that represents one of the curious, beautiful, wonderful things about our human experience, is that two people can have a very similar experience with a very similar thing and choose to have totally different responses to it. And they can change the trajectory of their life based on that one experience in ways that are very divergent from each other, and yet still reflect who that person is and what that person ultimately wants. I think that's a really cool insight. And there are a lot of those little curios that I have taken with me from the Book of Mormon that I do not require myself to expunge from my repertoire or attempt to get rid of from my mythic reserves. They are just part of the myths that have made me. And so as I conduct my spiritual and post-religious life, I engage deeply with history and try to understand what is actually historical versus what someone just wants to be historical in order to fit their ideological paradigm. I work to resurrect the origins of the Native American cultural myths and artifacts that have been taken or exploited by Western authors such as Joseph Smith. And I work to recognize and validate those kernels of wisdom that I did gain from reading the Book of Mormon. And whether those came from Joseph Smith himself or from some other preacher that Joseph was listening to doesn't matter so much to me. I am mostly concerned with the work of integrating everything I can from this text that I spent so much time with as a Mormon. So that's a wrap for the Book of Mormon and for this little brief introduction on how your mythic reservoir from your religious days does not have to be completely scrapped in order for you to start living your post-religious life. In fact, I think it's way better if you don't scrap it, because if you spend any significant amount of time in your religion, you have a huge amount of access and wisdom to the intricacies of that mythological reservoir that can still serve you in creating a new life on this side of religion. Just because the stories aren't true in a factual sense, or true in the sense that they reflect a religious truth, or true in the sense that they necessarily reflect your life now, doesn't mean that they are useless, doesn't mean that they are not valuable. You can still glean a huge amount of value from your mythic reservoir in religion and have that serve you now in your post-Mormon or your post-religious life. As with all my videos, I am wishing deep integration for you and healing from all of the trauma of religion, and hoping that you take those building blocks, that rubble that has been left for you by the dismantling of your faith, and build something new, something awesome, something really inspiring to guide you forward into the future. So thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.